Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing the rules of money you've trusted your entire life no longer apply. That your savings, your pension, even the dollars in your wallet don't hold the value you thought they did. Most people have no idea how close we are to that reality. Today, we're going to break it down: what's happening, why it matters, and most importantly, what you can do about it. I've spent my career thinking about systems, how they work, where they break, and what happens when the unthinkable becomes inevitable. And right now, we're living through something that's never happened before in human history. We're in completely uncharted territory, and most people are walking around like it's just another Tuesday. Think about it this way. 100 years ago, if the stock market crashed in London, it barely registered in Kansas City. People lived in separate economic bubbles. Your local bank was local, your job was tied to your town, and global events felt, well, global in the sense that they happened somewhere else entirely. But today we've created something unprecedented, a truly interconnected global economy where a hiccup in one corner of the world sends shockwaves everywhere else. It's like we've built a massive electrical grid where every component depends on every other component. When it works, it's incredibly efficient. When it doesn't, well, that's when things get interesting. This interconnection means that when America catches a cold, the entire world gets pneumonia. We saw glimpses of this during recent market turbulence, but we haven't seen the full picture yet. And here's what makes it even more volatile. We've added social media into the mix. Information, panic, confidence, and fear now travel at the speed of light. A rumor can become a bank run in hours, not weeks. You might be thinking, okay, but we've been through tough times before. We survived the 2008 financial crisis, the dot-com crash, even the oil crises of the 70s. And you're absolutely right. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night this time really is different. Not because the fundamental human emotions of fear and greed have changed, but because the scale and speed of everything has changed. When I look at complex systems, whether it's a rocket, a factory, or an economy, I always ask the same question. What happens when this system faces stress it was never designed to handle? And our current global financial system? It was never designed to handle the kind of interconnected, instantaneous, social media amplified stress we're capable of creating today. So, if this is new terrain for all of us, what exactly is at stake? Let's talk about what a real global depression actually means, because I think many people hear that word and think it's just a really bad recession. It's not. A recession is like a temporary power outage, inconvenient, maybe a little scary, but the infrastructure is still there, and eventually the lights come back on. A depression is different. It's when the power plant itself starts breaking down. In a depression, it's not just that markets fall and bounce back. It's that they fall and stay down for years. It's not just that some people lose jobs temporarily. It's that entire industries can disappear. It's not just that investments lose value. It's that the fundamental assumptions about what holds value start to crumble. Those of you who lived through the echoes of the Great Depression, or heard stories from parents and grandparents who did, understand this in your bones. It wasn't just about numbers on a page or stock charts. It was about real families, real communities, real lives turned upside down for years, not months. But here's what makes a potential global depression today even more challenging than the 1932nd back then. Most countries still had some economic independence. Today, we're all riding in the same boat. When that boat starts taking on water, there's nowhere else to swim. The emotional weight of this hits different when you're in your 60s and 70s, doesn't it? You've worked hard, saved responsibly, played by the rules. You've earned the right to some financial peace of mind. But the rules of the game might be changing in ways that have nothing to do with how well you played. But here's the thing, and this is where my perspective might surprise you. The roots of this danger don't lie in some mysterious, uncontrollable forces. They lie in something much simpler and much more concrete, the very money we use every day. Think about this for a moment. Every dollar in your wallet, every digit in your bank account represents a promise. But what happens when the entity making that promise starts breaking the fundamental rules of making promises? Throughout history, money was backed by something real: gold, silver, commodities that had intrinsic value. It was like having a car with a full tank of gas. You knew what you had. But since the early 1972nd, we've been running on something entirely different. We've been running on promises about promises, and those promises are being made by people who have discovered they can make as many promises as they want. Here's a way to think about it that might sound familiar if you've ever watched a SpaceX launch. When we're building a rocket, every component has to be real, tested, and verified. You can't fake the physics of getting to orbit. You can't print more thrust or imagine your way past the laws of thermodynamics. Reality has a way of asserting itself, usually dramatically. But our monetary system? It's like trying to run a rocket on fumes. You might get off the pad, you might even gain some altitude, but eventually physics catches up. And when it does, the landing isn't gentle. In recent years, we've printed trillions of dollars. Not millions, not billions, but trillions. To put that in perspective, if you counted to 1 trillion at one number per second, it would take you over 30,000 years. That's how much new money has been created out of thin air. At the same time, interest rates have been pushed to essentially zero, which is like removing gravity from the economic system. Things float around that should fall down, and nobody can tell what's real anymore. And then there's something called the repo market. Think of it as the plumbing system of the financial world. Most people have never heard of it, but it's where banks lend money to each other overnight to keep the whole system liquid. When that market starts showing stress, it's like hearing strange noises in your car's engine. You might not understand exactly what's happening, but you know it's not good. The interventions we've seen in this market, hundreds of billions of dollars injected just to keep the system running smoothly, those aren't signs of strength. They're signs of a system under enormous stress, being held together with increasingly expensive band-aids. And this isn't just theory. We've seen this movie before. There's a financial author who predicted the collapse of Lehman Brothers months before it happened. He went on national television and told anyone who would listen that this major investment bank was heading for disaster. Most people ignored him. Financial experts dismissed him. The bank's stock was still trading normally. But he understood something that most people missed. He was looking at the underlying fundamentals, not the surface appearances. When Lehman Brothers finally collapsed in 2008, it triggered a cascade that brought down the global economy. Average people lost their homes, their jobs, their retirement savings. Entire communities were devastated. But here's the interesting part. Some people who understood what was coming not only protected themselves, they actually made fortunes. This isn't about being callous or opportunistic. It's about understanding that in every crisis, wealth doesn't disappear, it changes hands. It moves from people who are unprepared to people who are prepared, from people who are hoping everything will be fine to people who are planning for reality. The 2008 crisis taught us something important. When systems break down, having the right knowledge and taking the right actions beforehand makes all the difference in the world. The people who suffered the most were those who trusted that someone else would take care of them. The people who thrived were those who took responsibility for their own financial education and made difficult decisions when those decisions were still optional. So if history shows both danger and opportunity, the key question becomes, how do you prepare? But before we can talk about solutions, we need to understand something that's been happening right under our noses for decades. It's something that affects every senior in America, but it's been so cleverly disguised that most people don't even realize they're victims of what might be the largest wealth transfer in human history. I'm talking about the systematic looting of American pensions and retirement funds. This isn't hyperbole or conspiracy theory, this is documented fact, and it's happening to firefighters, teachers, police officers, and private sector workers all across the country. Here's how it works, and why it matters so much to you. Back in the 1972nd, America made a fundamental shift in how we think about retirement. We moved away from traditional pensions, where your employer guaranteed you a specific income for life, to what we call defined contribution plans, like 401, where your retirement depends on how well the stock market performs. On the surface, this seemed reasonable. It gave people more control, more options. But what it really did was transfer the risk from large institutions that could handle market volatility to individual workers who had no training in investment management. It was like asking passengers to fly the plane instead of hiring pilots. But even worse than that shift was what happened to the traditional pensions that were supposed to be protected. Wall Street figured out ways to extract fees, commissions, and profits from pension funds while leaving retirees holding empty promises. Here's a real example that illustrates the scale of the problem. The average firefighter retiring today was promised benefits worth over $1 million. But when they go to collect, the money isn't there. It's been siphoned off through layers of fees, risky investments, and what can only be described as legalized theft. The mechanics of how this happens are complex, but the result is simple. Workers paid into systems their entire careers, believing they were securing their futures, only to discover that their futures were being quietly stolen by people in suits who never risked their own money. This creates a domino effect that most people don't see coming. When pension funds can't meet their obligations, who do you think picks up the tab? Taxpayers. When 401k plans lose value in market crashes, who suffers? The retirees who are counting on that money for healthcare, housing, and basic dignity in their later years. And here's what makes this even more personal for seniors. By the year 2030, over 2 billion baby boomers worldwide will be retiring. That's not a typo. 2 billion people, all around the same age, all trying to convert their paper promises into real goods and services at the same time. The math simply doesn't work. There aren't enough assets, enough real wealth, to honor all the promises that have been made. Countries around the world are facing this same crisis. Japan's struggling with it, Germany's struggling with it, and so is every other developed nation that made promises they can't keep. The baby boom generation created an unprecedented demographic bulge, and now that bulge is hitting retirement age all at once. If the promises can't be kept, individuals must think differently about wealth. This brings us to something that might sound old-fashioned, but is actually more relevant today than it's been in decades. The idea of owning real assets that hold their value regardless of what promises governments and corporations make. Let me tell you a story that illustrates this perfectly. In 1972, a young person bought a single gold coin for $50. It wasn't a huge investment, just something small, almost an afterthought. Today, that same coin is worth nearly $2,000. That's not a get-rich-quick scheme. That's almost 50 years of patient protection against exactly the kind of monetary debasement we're seeing today. But here's what makes the story even more interesting. During those same 50 years, the purchasing power of the dollar fell dramatically. What $50 could buy in 1972 would cost you several $100s today. So, while the gold coin was maintaining and growing its value, the paper dollars were steadily losing theirs. This is why I think of precious metals like energy storage for wealth. If dollars are like batteries that slowly drain over time, gold and silver are like solar panels. They keep generating value, regardless of what happens to the electrical grid. Silver might be even more interesting right now. It's trading at levels that seem almost absurd when you consider its industrial uses, its scarcity, and its historical relationship to gold. A silver coin today costs around $20, but many experts believe it should be worth much more based on fundamental supply and demand. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it's accessible to everyone. You don't need to be wealthy to buy a silver coin. You don't need special knowledge or connections. You just need to understand the difference between real assets and paper promises, and you need to act on that understanding. But here's what I find fascinating from a systems perspective. Less than 0.1% of Americans own any precious metals at all. Think about that. We're facing the largest monetary experiment in human history, with unprecedented risks to paper currencies, and virtually nobody is taking the most basic step to protect themselves. Why is that? It's not because they can't afford $20 for a silver coin. It's not because the information isn't available. We have more access to financial education than any generation in history. The real reason is something much more fundamental, and it explains why most people will struggle in the coming crisis while others will thrive. The reason is that most people simply cannot change, even when they know they need to, even when they have all the information, even when the consequences of not changing are staring them in the face. I learned this lesson the hard way when building companies. You can have the most brilliant engineers, the most detailed plans, the clearest evidence that a new approach is necessary, and still watch talented people resist change until it's too late. It's not stupidity, it's human nature. We're wired to stick with familiar patterns, even when those patterns are leading us off a cliff. But here's what I've discovered. The biggest power any person can develop is the power to change internally. Not just to change their circumstances, but to change their thinking, their habits, their relationship with risk and opportunity. Most people never develop this power, and that's why they keep getting the same results year after year, decade after decade. Think about how a baby learns to walk. They fall down constantly. Every single attempt ends in failure for weeks or months. But do they give up? Do they decide walking is too dangerous? Of course not. They keep trying, because they haven't been taught that failure is something to avoid. They understand instinctively that failure is how you learn. But somewhere along the way, our education system teaches us the opposite. We learn to avoid mistakes at all costs. We learn to stick with what's safe, what's approved, what everyone else is doing. We learn to punish ourselves for being wrong instead of rewarding ourselves for trying. This creates a fundamental problem when it comes to money and investing. The people who do well with money are the people who are willing to be wrong, to learn from their mistakes, to try new approaches when the old ones stop working. But most people have been programmed to do exactly the opposite. I was talking recently with a doctor who's been hearing warnings about economic troubles for years. He admitted he's never acted on any of them. "You've been saying this stuff for decades." He told me. I never listened. But now, watching his retirement accounts fluctuate wildly, watching inflation eat away at his purchasing power, he's finally asking, "What do I do now?" It's a heartbreaking conversation because the time to prepare for a storm is before the storm hits, not when you're already getting soaked. But it also illustrates something important. People don't change because of information. They change because of consequences. They change when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of doing something different. The problem is, by the time most people feel that pain, their options have become much more limited and much more expensive. But here's where this story takes an interesting turn, and why I'm actually optimistic about what's coming, even though it's going to be challenging for many people. Every major crisis creates major opportunities, not just for the wealthy, not just for the connected, but for anyone who understands what's happening and positions themselves accordingly. The key is to think like an entrepreneur, even if you've never started a business in your life. When I look at a crisis, I don't just see problems. I see systems breaking down and creating space for new solutions. I see assets becoming available at prices that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. I see ordinary people suddenly motivated to learn things they should have learned years ago. After 2008, while most people were hiding and hoping things would return to normal, smart investors were borrowing money at historically low interest rates and buying real estate, businesses, and other assets at fire sale prices. They understood something fundamental. Crashes don't destroy wealth. They redistribute it. Think of it like a massive clearance sale on everything that matters. Suddenly, assets that were overpriced become reasonably priced. Properties that were out of reach become accessible. Businesses that were expensive to start become cheap to buy. But here's the catch. You have to be prepared to act when others are paralyzed by fear. This doesn't require being wealthy to start with. Some of the biggest fortunes in American history were built by people who started with very little but understood how to recognize and act on opportunity during difficult times. What it requires is education, preparation, and the psychological ability to move when everyone else is frozen. For seniors, this might seem overwhelming. You might be thinking, "I'm past the age of taking big risks or starting over." But that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting that you think about small actions that can have big protective effects. Remember that silver coin we talked about? That's not about getting rich quick. That's about taking one small step to protect yourself from currency debasement. But if you take that step, and then another, and then another, you start building a foundation that's independent of government promises and corporate pension plans. Real estate works the same way. You don't need to become a property mogul overnight. But understanding how debt and taxes work in real estate, how you can use other people's money to buy assets that generate income and appreciate over time, that understanding can be incredibly powerful, even in small applications. The beautiful thing about real assets during inflationary periods is that they tend to hold their value while paper assets lose theirs. When the cost of everything goes up, the value of things that produce necessities, housing, energy, food production goes up too. But the value of promises to pay you back in increasingly worthless currency goes down. And here's something most people don't realize. You don't need perfect timing to benefit from this. You just need to be positioned correctly before the major shifts happen. This brings us to the bigger picture of what we're really facing and what it means for the future of America and the world. We're living through what I call the everything bubble. Real estate prices inflated beyond any reasonable relationship to income or economic fundamentals. Stock markets trading at levels that only make sense if you assume endless growth and endless liquidity. Bond markets pricing in assumptions about interest rates and government stability that may prove to be wildly optimistic. It's like we've built a massive house of cards, and each card represents a different market, a different assumption, a different promise that may not be keepable. When something like this unravels, it doesn't happen in slow motion. It happens in cascades, where each failure triggers the next failure, and the next, until systems that seemed stable yesterday are gone tomorrow. But here's what I find fascinating about moments like this. They're when the real innovations happen. When old systems break down, space opens up for new solutions. When old institutions fail, entrepreneurs create new institutions. When old ways of thinking prove inadequate, new ways of thinking emerge. This isn't just abstract philosophy, it's practical reality. Some of the most valuable companies in the world today were started during recessions or depressions. Some of the greatest fortunes were built when everyone else thought the world was ending. Some of the most important innovations came from people who refused to accept that collapse was the end of the story. For individuals, especially seniors who have lived through multiple economic cycles, this historical perspective can be incredibly valuable. You've seen challenges before. You've watched systems change, adapt, and evolve. You understand that what seems permanent rarely is, and what seems impossible sometimes happens faster than anyone expects. The question isn't whether change is coming, change is always coming. The question is whether you'll be someone who gets swept along by change or someone who adapts to it intelligently and benefits from it. When systems are fragile, resilience isn't built by waiting for rescue. It's built by creating your own lifeboat. Not because you're selfish or antisocial, but because the most valuable thing you can do for your family, your community, and your country is to make sure you're not part of the problem when things get difficult. This means taking responsibility for your own financial education, especially if you've never had to do that before. It means making decisions based on facts and fundamentals rather than hope and wishful thinking. It means accepting that the rules you've lived by for decades might not be the rules that will serve you in the coming decades. But it also means recognizing opportunity where others see only threat. It means understanding that every crisis creates winners as well as losers, and the main difference between them is preparation, education, and the willingness to act when action is required. For seniors watching this, I want you to understand something important. This isn't about fear, and it's not about despair. This is about empowerment. This is about taking control of things you can't control, instead of hoping someone else will take care of things you can't control. You have advantages that younger people don't have. You have experience with economic cycles. You have the perspective that comes from living through multiple decades of change. You have resources, even if they feel modest, that can be positioned more intelligently. And you have something that's incredibly valuable in uncertain times. You understand the difference between what's truly important and what's just noise. The silver coin, the gold coin, the real estate investment, the business opportunity, these aren't just financial moves. They're ways of betting on your own judgment instead of betting on the promises of institutions that may not be able to keep their promises. They're ways of saying, I understand that change is coming, I'm prepared for it, and I'm going to make sure that when the dust settles, I'm still standing. So what do you do now? How do you start building that lifeboat? Start small, but start today. Buy one silver coin, not to get rich, but to prove to yourself that you can take action. Read one book about money that challenges your assumptions. Have one conversation with someone who understands real estate or precious metals or business opportunities. The goal isn't to become an expert overnight. The goal is to become someone who takes responsibility for their own financial future instead of hoping that someone else will do it for you. Because here's what I believe with absolute conviction. The people who understand what's happening and prepare accordingly won't just survive what's coming, they'll thrive. They'll look back on this period not as the time when everything fell apart, but as the time when they finally took control of their financial destiny. The future belongs to people who can adapt, who can learn, who can recognize opportunity in the middle of chaos. You've lived through enough change to know that adaptation is possible. You've seen enough cycles to know that every ending is also a beginning. The question isn't whether you can do this. The question is whether you will. The time to start is now. While starting is still a choice rather than a necessity. While preparation is still optional rather than desperate. While you can still move thoughtfully instead of reactively. Most people have no idea what's about to happen, but now you do. The question is, what are you going to do about it?